Imagine waking up in the past. No medicine, no electricity, no help coming. History, if we're being honest, isn't a story about heroes or empires. It isn't a list of dates and names. It's about survival, the daily fight to make it to tomorrow. It isn't about glory. It's about grit and a fair amount of luck. Because surviving the past, that's the part we never talk about. This is Too Complicated for History. Welcome to Too Complicated for History. I am Isaac S. Loftus, joined always by my wonderful co-host, Dr. Lynn Robbins.
Hey everyone, we are very happy today to have as our guest Louee Dessent. He is a historian, producer, presenter, and writer, and a whole host of other things. And he's also the host of the YouTube channel Survive History. Thanks so much for being here with us today, Louee.
Thank you very much for having me, guys.
So, as someone with history in my background, I'm interested if you could tell us a little bit about your background, but then how you ended up with a really popular YouTube channel. Sort of what was the road you took for that?
Sure, yeah. Not kind of an obvious route, really. I mean, it won't surprise to hear you, I loved history from when I was a kid. Growing up, I was the kid in school who wasn't necessarily afraid to sort of say that I loved history, despite the fact that it probably wasn't very cool. And I ended up studying it at university. So I did a 3-year undergrad and then a 2-year master's. And that was all Roman history. So ancient history, Latin, ancient Greek in there. So that was kind of my focus and for quite a long time. I then went down the journalism route and ended up writing for magazines, and I worked for quite a big news company for quite a while. Ended up specializing in running YouTube channels for news, for kind of international affairs. And then through that, a job eventually came up at a company called History Hit. I ended up going and launching their YouTube channel, which grew very, very fast, was quite soon one of the biggest sort of history channels on the platform. And that was a great experience, really got me back into sort of loving history in a media sense, in a kind of sense of making documentaries and films about it. And it was after History Hit that I ended up setting up my own channel.
Huh. Well, that's a pretty interesting thing. And Lynn, you had a similar sort of path as far as the journalism route too, right? That's actually
Yes, I actually
surprising.
started out as a journalism undergrad. I have a journalism degree and started working in that. And then I realized I wanted to write about people who were long dead instead of people who were still doing things today for
Sometimes
whatever
they're more
reason.
interesting, right?
Right, exactly. And you don't have to worry about them, reading what you write about them. So it's sort of a little safer.
Nice. I mean, it would be a busy time if you were writing about people who are alive in America at the moment, right? It's
Exactly.
pretty interesting over there. I mean, I actually, my full-time job, because I don't do Survive History full time, so I am still working in news at the moment, and yeah, it's a pretty busy time. So I get a little bit of both, which is nice.
Nice.
Did you ever have aspirations? I know you sort of fell into like the YouTube stuff after you started working. Did you have aspirations when you were in school of like, writing the definitive books on things, or was alternative methods for exploring this stuff always kind of interesting to you?
Yeah, I always like writing. I like writing sort of creative stories. I mean, I don't really remember if I thought that I would sort of do history as a job. I think when I was a very little, I wanted to be a paleontologist. I was obsessed with dinosaurs.
That's a good one.
Cool.
But for some reason, journalism was the thing that kind of drew me. It almost like history was the passion, but the reality was more like, okay, well, what's the actual job that I'm gonna do? With
Sure.
the kind of with whatever skills I had at the time. So yeah, I certainly didn't necessarily believe that I would be doing something like I'm doing now with Survive History. It's come as a bit of a surprise, and yeah, I'm very grateful because it's everything that I like doing in one place. Yeah.
So for those who haven't had a chance to check it out, could you do what's the elevator pitch for Survive History?
Yeah, so the channel is it's a kind of immersive experience. So for anyone who likes historical films or video games, the idea is that you would click on one of our videos and you will be immersed in that time period and be entertained and learn a little bit along the way as as the host, attempt to survive a specific historical period. That's usually at the moment in some kind of military sense, a soldier in an army or whatever it happens to be. But basically taking on a daring, a dangerous, or a dirty job from history and seeing how I would cope with it.
The thing I love about your channel is that we always hear it too complicated. We like history that we want it to come alive because people want something that's relevant to them. They want to know individuals. They don't want to just hear names and dates. And your channel is so much fun for that. And I'm just interested in some of your experiences in doing this. And have you learned anything about yourself? Like, was there any historic moment that you thought, oh, this would be it'd be easy to live in this time, and then you did the episode, we're like, oh my goodness, this is nothing like I expected, because I think we have the tendency to say, I miss the good old days,
Mm.
when we had to kill our own food and we didn't have indoor bathrooms, and then all of a sudden you realize, wait, they weren't that good after all.
Yeah, I don't think I would personally have survived any of the episodes that we've worked on, to be honest. I mean, I sometimes find, sometimes it's the small things like the other day I had a real issue with drawing a sword from a scabbard. And I was like, this should be the easiest thing I do today. And I was like, it's just not coming out. So no, there are lots of things there are lots of moments in our episodes that are kind of otherworldly in the kind of level of grit that you would need to survive them. I think for me, having an 18-month-old, I know I can do without sleep.
Sure.
Right.
But food, food would be a bit of an issue for me. Not in a kind of flippant sense, like I love to eat, but almost like my decision making after, when I'm hungry just goes downhill so rapidly. I think particularly as guys, we like to imagine that in these situations, if we were thrown into, a battle, we'd do okay. But then I just remind myself, oh yeah, if I'm having a late lunch, then I kind of fall apart. So
yeah, there is a tendency towards male arrogance for these kinds of things. I was just recently talking to someone about how I think it's like some absurdly high number, like 65-70% of men think they could fight a gorilla. I was like, I was amongst
And win, I assume you're saying.
or even
Win,
just go toe
or not
to
just
toe.
die.
Yeah, right. Not just be completely torn in half immediately. I was like, I was in the smaller percentile. I was like, even a small monkey could probably take me. Need to be a big one.
There's a similar thing. Something. Don't quote me on this, but something like 80% of men believe they could land a plane if the pilot was out of action.
Yeah,
something along those lines. And I would say in this context, of course not. But then a couple of beers down, maybe.
Listen,
maybe.
And you've got the drink cart right there on the plane. You give it a go.
Exactly, bit of confidence.
That's really funny. So who are you interacting with in these videos? Because there's lots of other folks in these videos along with you, right? So when you're sort of immersing yourself, how do you go about immersing yourself in a time period that doesn't exist anymore?
Yeah, so we've got a really strong living history community in the UK, and we work with these groups because they are the people who are, attempting to bring the period to life. We work with some groups very closely on a lot of our episodes. So there's a group called the Worcestershire Cavalry who appear in quite a few of our episodes and, are fantastic at what they do. They do sort of multiple periods. Other groups do very, very specific niches, like, the French army in 1781. And we kind of have room for all of that within our episodes. And, consciously, we don't use armchair historians, in an academic setting. We certainly invite experts in their field onto our shows, but they have to get into the kit and be willing to kind of do the do, if you know what I mean. So yeah, I mean, we work with a broad range of colorful characters, but the key requirement is that they are part of that immersive experience, and everything that they bring to the show makes you feel like you are right there in that time period.
And I imagine that they do their pastime or their job as a historical interpreter partly for educational purposes. And I think you mentioning about when you're hungry, sort of all bets are off. And I'm the same way. But then you think about that and you think of like with the American Civil War, they never had enough food, or the revolution. For here in the US, when you think about war, you think, well, they're always hungry, they probably haven't slept well, and just the conditions that they're in and how that could impact the course of the war or political decisions. So, are there any other things that maybe you learned from one of your experiences that you don't think you could have gotten just from reading a book on it, or something that really you had to experience it to really understand?
Yeah, lots of things. It's interesting what you say there. Yeah, I think sometimes the impressions that we would get from movies and from even contemporary paintings are that things looked nice and everyone was, at least sort of soldiers were well put together. But then if you read the accounts, most of the time they end up walking around with no shoes on. Which is something that we would accept as pretty basic. I think one thing that getting into the gear teaches you, it was very, very rarely built for comfort. Talking of shoes,
Right.
they weren't comfortable. One thing that I find very frustrating, because I'm trying to carry my script around, is they very rarely had pockets.
Yeah.
Welcome to being a woman.
Fair play. I mean, they had, I can try and fit my script into the cartridge pouch. I even sort of wedged my iPhone, because I needed that for my lines the other day, into a cartridge pouch, and then nearly lost it. So yeah, that's kind of one thing that you learn is, things weren't built to make people happy. Everything was geared towards being practical, and making sure that you could carry as much as possible. And if you get into armor, for example, you understand that if you're standing out in the cold, that armor essentially turns you into a fridge. If you're filming on a kind of cold day in January,
Right.
yeah, there were all sorts of things that you can only learn by sort of trying it out as they did.
Mhm.
Yeah, I guess that example really makes sense why people had a general agreement to not fight in the wintertime. Like, hey,
Yeah.
we're just not going to do it. We're just going to agree to disagree in the spring.
Yeah,
Right. Let's press
totally.
pause.
Yeah, totally. Just getting along a road in winter. There's this great example from an episode we did on the Jacobite Rebellion, and there's a guy called Marshall Wade who's chasing the Jacobite rebels as they kind of come down into England and invade. And I find reading the story of what he does kind of maddeningly frustrating, because he only seems to move like a tiny distance over periods that feel like weeks and months. And it's like, why aren't you intercepting them? Well, it was snowy. He just couldn't move this massive army around the roads when there was snow on the ground. His soldiers, as mentioned, they didn't have shoes. So, what are you going to do basically in that situation?
How far back are you going in your exploration
Yeah.
currently? Because you talked about armor of various types. You talked about, you're interested in Roman history and stuff like that. So is it all typically, because you're in England, focused around English history and like local stuff?
It is fairly, I would say, European focused at the moment. So the furthest we've gone back is the Roman Empire. I mean, I would love to do Greek hoplites, for example, but there just aren't many Greek hoplite, sandal wearing, reenactors in the UK, because that wouldn't be be very nice. So yeah, the scope of the channel can really cover the whole swathe of history. And I would love to travel a little bit further outside the UK at some point and do American history, for example. And we are actually this year we're doing 2 episodes on the American Revolution, which is a collaboration with History Hit. So we've filmed that. I've actually got one more shoot for that this weekend, but that's going to be a really exciting one. But it is using British reenactors, so hopefully your audience will forgive us for that.
Well, at the time, they were all British. So technically speaking.
True.
Depending on what year,
Yeah,
right?
depending on what year, yeah. So go ahead, Lynn. Sorry.
No, you go ahead, Isaac.
I was just going to say that I think that your channel reminds me of stuff that used to be on, like, that I would have watched on the History Channel when I was a teenager. A kind of like a format show that like really had a sort of a quirky way in to this. And I was curious how you found YouTube as a platform for sharing this. Like, is there like large history audiences? I know that I consume a lot of history content on YouTube, but I'm an atypical viewer, I suppose, because I work in the space. So do you find that you found an active, engaged, enthusiastic audience on that digital platform?
Yeah, I think the advantage of YouTube is it gives you the space to publish videos that are a lot longer. So
I mean, in comparison to like other
in comparison to TikTok, Instagram, those kind of places. So we liked as the team of Survive History, we like documentaries, and we kind of like that length of show to tell a full story and to kind of give it the kind of epic scale that we wanted to. So YouTube is probably the right place for us. It kind of allows us to do that, but obviously we do publish kind of short vertical clips as well, which actually attract way more views, but we kind of hope that people watching them actually then come and watch the full thing, because naturally what happens is if you show someone a 45-second snippet about any historical topic, then they'll say, well, you missed this out. And then you're like, well, please come and see the full context on the kind of main channel. We love making long documentaries. It's not the easiest way for us to kind of do it, but it's what we like doing. Yeah.
I know you enjoyed watching me struggle with this sword and scabbard. Please watch the full video where I finally get it out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. That's the full 45 minutes. Yeah, it's really disappointing.
Do you have any idea of who your audience is? And do you know if maybe you're bringing in people who initially wouldn't have been interested in a historical documentary per se? Because I think about the really popular movies these days. You've got a lot of action movies. People are constantly being shot and chopped up and all the violence. And I don't know if the interest in that is, like we said, about imagining yourself landing a plane, but imagining yourself in this situation and maybe being the hero of the day. But have you found that you're reaching people who maybe other forms of historical education isn't as interesting for or doesn't reach?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, the stats would tell us that our largest audience is American, younger men. And we know anecdotally from a lot of the comments we get that a lot of these guys, play historical video games, basically the same ones that I played growing up. So things like Total War. There's quite a lot of Roblox players who kind of comment on our channel. Which it makes sense to me, because that is how I got into history in the kind of the entertainment sense of it. Most people these days will engage with history through TV shows or films or games, and I think we are one step away from that, whilst still being, an educational documentary. So yeah, I would like to think that we do kind of provide that bridge for those type of people who maybe don't engage so much with a more academic show.
Yeah, well, that's definitely how I definitely got into the history space via entertainment as well. Like, at least that's how the interest was sparked. I'm looking forward to you doing some episodes in the Aegean or whatever, and pairing it with the movie Troy, the Brad
Mm.
Pitt or whatever. Pat,
Mm.
our producer, who's not on screen right now, makes fun of me for quoting that movie all of the time.
Yeah. It's Gladiator for me, but
Yeah, I mean, Gladiator's a slightly better film.
yeah, maybe. The critics would say.
Yeah. Was there anything actually in so far you've gone, you found something difficult? Was there anything that was generally frightening in these
Yeah.
experiences, like or
Mm.
even the scenario that you're like, this seems like a nightmare in totality?
Yeah, I think so. For episode 3, which we did on the English Civil War, I decided that I was going to try and survive as a parliamentarian cavalryman and ride a horse around.
Okay.
Even though I'd had a few lessons when I was about 7 years old, but hadn't ridden since then. But I thought, I've got to jump into this. Many cavalry recruits in the 1640s would have had. They'd probably have had more experience than me, but they would have had limited experience. And I quite liked the idea that I was coming into it really as a completely raw recruit. And so again, that was with the Worcestershire Cavalry, and I'm riding around on this huge horse called Windsor, who luckily for me is a kind of gentle giant. But there were some bits where, he kind of went beyond a trot that were a little bit scary for sure. So there's one scene we did where I tried to chop a cabbage off the top of a post, which was typical kind of training at the time, and yeah, the cabbage nearly won that one basically.
How about in the historical sense? Like, if I were in this real environment, thank goodness I get to go home tonight, because if I was placed in this thing, this would be a total nightmare.
Yeah, I think so. So we recently did an episode on Viking settlers in Iceland and Greenland and Vinland, and I do often think like the quality of life that they must have had in Scandinavia to take the risks that they did to go to these places must have been terrible, because the kind of sagas that we use to research the episode, they talk very casually about half of the ships in a kind of civilian fleet traveling to these places just getting lost in storms. That was pretty normal. You travel on your travel out to your new destination. Half the people don't make it. That's pretty normal. And then you get there and you have to survive somewhere where there are no other humans. You've got to find your plot of land. It's cold, although probably not as cold as it is now, but it's cold. Very limited fertility or areas that you can kind of create farms. It is an environment that is dark a lot of the time, and essentially you would have to make sure that all of the food that you needed was stockpiled during the spring and summer. And if you went into winter with like limited amounts to keep you going, that was probably it for you. And I just think the isolation of that and the fact that you've taken such a risk to get there, it just seems really unappealing to me.
Even the ships that they crossed the North Sea and the North Atlantic, and the fact that they didn't have any like roofs, like they're just in an open canoe, basically, through these giant waves, covering yourself with a blanket to get out of the storm. It seems insane. If I was a Viking during the Viking Age, I would have probably volunteered to go if I had to choose east. I would rather be like, hey, one of the guys that ended up in the Byzantine Empire. Right. Send me down the Volga.
I mean, if you make it into the Varangian Guard, you have made it. So
exactly.
That's probably a better choice. But probably quite a dangerous journey to get there as well.
I'm sure that there's some things about it that I'm overlooking, but I don't like the cold. There's a reason I live in Los Angeles.
So I'm curious if, having done so many of these episodes, Do you think people in a particular era, or as we like to say back then, were sort of tougher or more resilient than we are today, which is it's easy to sort of go that route? Or do you think it's more of a product of circumstances? I guess you've seen a lot of different situations and what people survive through and, what they didn't survive through. And I'm just curious, has that changed sort of how you see people today?
So the titles of our episodes are "Could You Survive?" and that, in some ways, is a bit of an odd question, because a lot of the things that will kill you in these kind of different historical periods is down to luck, and uh, the rest of it is, how long can you keep going? So if you find yourself in, I don't know, let's say you're part of the American invasion of Canada in 1776. They're going through a pretty tough time, but most people in that situation, i- unless you decide to just sit down and give up, you're probably going to take each moment as it comes, right? You're gonna keep going, you'll keep walking, you'll keep going until something stops you, whether that's dysentery or whatever it
The
happens.
wall outside of Quebec.
Precisely, yeah, a kind of some a big musket ball, that kind of thing. But yeah, I don't know if it's that humans physiologically were tougher. I think it's that they were just they were acclimatized to a base level of comfort that is so far below our own. Um,
Mhm.
and yeah, I think if the three of us were taken back 300 years, yeah, we'd find it horrible, and we would probably complain a lot more than they would. But eventually, and if give it a couple of years, you'd probably get used to it,
Mhm.
Say
unless unless you're taken out by a disease.
sure.
Yeah,
Although I say,
absolutely.
if we were in Greenland and it was the three of us, you can just eat me first. It's fine.
Yeah,
Happy to
yeah.
volunteer.
Not even gonna try to survive that.
Yeah, I'll
Like,
toss
I'm
myself
cold
off
and I'm
of a
done.
rock,
Yeah.
whatever it takes.
You've gone for give up.
Yeah, I know too. Especially if it was my consciousness now, I know too much. I remember how comfortable my memory foam bed was.
Yeah. It's very true. Very true.
So I'm curious, do you have a favorite episode? A someplace that you actually would have been willing to go back and attempt to survive, or maybe one that just for whatever reason was most interesting to you?
Yeah, I think they're quite different questions. Uh, my favorite episode, it's very hard to choose, actually, because I often think that the latest episode that we've put out
Mhm.
is my favorite, and the one that I have just put a lot of effort and time into. We did a really great episode, I thought, on the Roman Special Forces, where
Hmm.
we had an amazing setting, this place called Park in the Past, where they've basically reconstructed a Roman auxiliary fort. We
Mhm.
had our Romans, we had barbarians, we had cavalry, we had all sorts of different elements to kind of play with, and that was a really, really fun day. That's not to say that I would want to be in the Roman Special Forces, because explorators basically went out into the wild and had to survive for months on their own using bushcraft.
Gosh.
So yeah, I might actually give up, within a couple of days of having to do that, given my very limited outdoorsy skills. Um, but in terms of one that I would actually want to go back to, not sure, to be honest. Not sure. I think it's interesting that we tend to think that, particularly soldiers in war, it was all miserable. But actually, if you read diaries, a lot of them had quite a good time. I think particularly the Second World War, a lot of veterans. When they write about it, tend to see the positive sides and the kind of camaraderie, and some even the First World War. Some people thought that they'd had a good time, and obviously you don't want to glorify it, so perhaps those kind of that side of the story is kind of minimalized a little bit, but it is there. but no, I'm not sure if I would have gone back to any of them. I think Roman legionaries, they had a very tough life, but they were actually fairly well catered for. So there's a nice anecdote of a Roman. It's probably an auxiliary fort up on Hadrian's Wall, where we have the surviving Vindolanda tablets, and one of them is a request for beer to come up to the wall because they're running short. So, I think I could probably manage up there closer to home for a little while.
Yeah, there was a moment where I think the logistics of and the complexity of like Roman society mimicked, not anywhere near our own, but there was some level of like, you know, efficiencies and sort of how they were distributing goods and things like that would probably feel a little more modern. Not to say that it was more comfortable than stuff that followed afterward, because I think that's a matter of perspective probably, but it would feel more akin to now. Like you could write a letter, be like, please send more beer. And they would have like,
Yeah.
Right.
a cask of something. Like there was a beer supply guy that brought it up, and, they had all of those logistics and sort of stuff all ironed out that feel more modern than I think,
Yeah.
someone,
If you read the letters of someone like Pliny the Younger, who is like top tier elite in Rome, but actually you read his letters and it could be from the 21st century, because his main concerns are, what his friends think of him, what his ambitions for his family members are, whether he can host a good dinner party, that kind of thing. And you read it and you're like, okay, yeah, I actually kind of recognize this mindset. So yeah, there was definitely, it wasn't all doom and gloom. Some people
Right.
lived fairly well.
Yeah. Like I know that they've, recently discovered some archaeological digs where there's like, tubs of face cream that were like manufactured and sold. It wasn't like someone did it at their house. Like they bought them from some sort of, body shop or or like Keels of the time, which is, that's a pretty interesting. And then, cut to Viking era Scandinavia, and life was just very different, so it would probably feel very foreign.
But yeah, people cared about, people were still had their vanity and cared what they looked like, and those are the kind of elements that interest me in my videos. Sometimes it's not necessarily what they would do to survive, but what they would do to make themselves feel more comfortable. In Napoleon's army, for example, only certain people, kind of grenadiers, would be allowed to wear a mustache, and they'd be very proud of it, and they would sort of style it in a certain way. And you kind of, you remember that these people weren't just thinking about starvation. They had a view of themselves and how they were seen by their friends and comrades that we would recognize probably.
Did you grow one out for that episode?
I had a stick-on mustache that
Just as good.
I
Just
do
as good.
a little sketch at the end of the video, which I won't spoil because it's comedy gold. But there is a little sketch with a mustache.
You have to watch it.
Yeah, exactly.
I love that you're making history relevant in that people can see themselves in your videos. And I think that's what makes history so interesting, is that it's not this foreign land, this other time that we can't imagine, but we can actually see ourselves and see why learning it is relevant. Were there any individual historical individuals who you learned about that maybe you have more admiration for or didn't know existed? Or the opposite? Was there anyone you thought maybe was a positive person and you realized maybe they were a little more conniving than you had initially thought about them?
So, one guy who springs to mind is an Irish rifleman in the 95th Rifles called Tom Plunkett, and he was famous for shooting a French general from a vast distance, and then. To prove it wasn't a fluke, he reloaded and he shot the French general's aide-de-camp. And so he became, within the British Army at the time, a kind of celebrity.
Okay.
But his life was was very, very troubled. Most people, if you were to look at him on Wikipedia, that may be all that you kind of hear about him. But he was clearly a raving alcoholic, and he was like disciplined many, many times. There's one point where he locked himself in a shed and wouldn't let an officer come in, and he was threatening them with his loaded firearm. And then later in life, he ended up sort of begging on the streets of London, as I remember it. And the sort of the system of care after this sort of legendary figure left the army was almost non-existent. And so, individual stories like that remind you that for every kind of heroic story, there is a full kind of life timeline. And sometimes, that does not reflect the kind of the moment that they're known for.
And how do you deal with stuff that sort of, obviously the show's supposed to be entertaining, right? At a certain level, that's one of the goals. But how do you deal with stuff that's sort of, not the same, like that is, unsavory or uncomfortable, or okay, these guys they killed a lot of people, and when they did some things that weren't otherwise admirable. How do you navigate those things? Because you're jumping around with so many different historical contexts and stuff. Is it, do you consult with historians, or are you guys just thinking about how it comes across on camera and how it fits in with your larger story?
Yeah, it's really, really challenging. I think there has to be both. There has to be the kind of the light and shade in all episodes. And for me personally, some of the most poignant moments in episodes that we've done are the more serious bits. And at the end of the episode, I do the kind of could you survive summary, and that tends to be a little bit more reflective, and tries to summarize some of the real difficulties. And I don't tend to sort of make light of it at that point. But I think despite that, you can find a way of injecting some kind of humor even into quite dark scenarios. So an episode that we're releasing very, very soon is on the First World War. Like I said, the First World War cavalry. And this was one of the most dangerous jobs you could possibly imagine. Like only a third of British cavalrymen ended the war, physically unscathed. About a third of them would die. 2/3 would be injured at some point. So seriously dangerous job. But they saw the war through a humorous lens, and they're always joking about what their officers are telling them, and their kind of persistent optimism that every single time they go on an attack, even though it's the 100th time, this is going to be the one where we'll break through, and we'll bring back the Kaiser's head on the tip of a sword. They can see that this is this is nonsense, and so I think when we kind of do add that touch of humor in, it's in some ways in keeping with the way that they saw it at the time.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense that people have all sorts of attitudes that allow them to do the thing that is remarkable or seemingly impossible to do. Because I can imagine being part of a cavalry charge across into a line of machine guns, which is what at the beginning of that war what they were doing.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully the episode will dispel some of the kind of myths about that, because they weren't totally stupid. I mean, cavalry were used in a fairly forward-thinking way, but having said that, they certainly did charge towards machine guns at some point, and they were told there was kind of a theory that German machine guns would only start inflicting heavy casualties within the last 60 yards of a charge, which I thought this was something that you'd how comforting it would be to be told that as you were just about to,
as you're to get out of the trench. Right now we're fine. It's after we get across the field.
Exactly. So things like that I always pick out and just wonder how you'd react at the time, and yet they still went and did it. So
yeah, there's my father worked with a bunch of knew some folks from the Air Force, fighter pilots specifically. And I got a chance to meet them, and um, what some of them did was absolutely insane, like as for their job. But they all had a particular mindset of like they basically thought they were invincible, like they had bought it
Yeah.
and they're sort of pre-selected to be able to. You guys are the ones that are going to do that. So it's interesting that you saw, a similar. I imagine the people who weren't able to cope with sort of the situation sort of filtered out of that cavalry, like out of those jobs, and then you're seeing the survivor's bias a little bit, not from the war side, not from like the casualty side, but just from the mental predisposition of being able to get on a horse and do this kind of crazy stuff.
Yeah, exactly. You would have to sort of filter out all normal human cognitive processes, right, in
Right.
order to do that. And I think, clearly humans are capable of doing that, because many kind of ordinary people uh, manage to charge towards machine guns or cannon fire or
Yeah.
whatever it happened to be. Um, so yeah, I think um, I think that is a case of the human the human body's ability to kind of take you forward, and to block certain things out, and to block fear out, which is very, very interesting. And I'm sure it gets better with practice.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's true right back, thousands of years ago till today, isn't it?
You mentioned a myth, or your one of your episodes dispelling some myths. What are some bigger ones that you've, as far as like the general understanding that turns out to be incorrect that you've come across?
Yeah, I absolutely love myths. And what I find really amusing is that almost every story that has become a trope about a particular battle, or whatever it happens to be, there's probably a grain of truth in it, but actually, when you dig into it, it turns out not to be true. So we did an episode on the Jacobite Rebellion, and the famous battle within that, the Battle of Culloden, where Bonnie Prince Charlie is defeated. Um, you will hear that that happened because the British soldiers were taught to stab their bayonets to the right hand side. And basically, this would negate the Highlanders' targe, their shield, and their broadsword, and this was the way they would stab across. And each man in the redcoat line had to trust in the man to their left. And it actually turns out that the newspaper that printed this story retracted it 6 months later, and it was made up.
Really?
Yeah, I thought this was such an
Oh.
interesting find. It was a kind of a local Scottish newspaper printed the story, had sort of given a source as a kind of British soldier, and then there is no other evidence that happened. And yeah,
Mhm.
it turned out that they couldn't back up their story. So I kind of love that, because fake news is it sells. We know that today, right? It's quite
Yeah.
easy to kind of get people to believe a story if it sounds really interesting.
If you don't care about the truth, you can say a lot of crazy stuff.
Mhm.
Exactly. I, and I don't think it's a humdrum thing to do, to kind of analyze these myths, and look at the kind of the actual kind of truth behind them. I think that's really, really interesting, and it's a really interesting exploration of the way humans like to ingest history, and like to ingest stories. And uh, generally speaking, if someone isn't into history, they will still know a famous trope about a particular historical figure. So Henry VIII biting off his chicken legs and throwing them over his shoulder, that kind of thing. Again, is there any evidence for that? Probably not. But I quite like the fact that we can, as historians, kind of delve into this and look at the truth behind it, which sometimes is more interesting.
So, one thing I'm curious about is in regards to you personally. A lot of people, I imagine that a lot of people in all of these eras saw their era perhaps as the most difficult, or it's never been this tough before, and we hear that today. And so I'm wondering if in all of, the surviving history you've done and all of the research you've done, has it changed your perception on the present, or when things happen today that seem or are major changes, tragedies, difficult circumstances, does that sort of give you this belief in sort of the human ability to survive? Does it make you, I don't know, more positive about today? Or maybe the opposite?
It sort of does. In one sense, it does make you more positive knowing that, um, Roman writers loved saying that they were living in the end times. And
Mhm.
if they were writing in the 5th century, then they were clearly right. But even at the height of the Roman Empire, they were always complaining that the good old days were in the past. And they almost always complain about young people today and how how they have the wrong attitude. So I love finding references like that. I suppose the difference today is that we have nuclear weapons, and so
Yeah.
that makes it all a little bit kind of riskier,
Mhm.
without bringing without bringing the tone down too much. So yes, history does repeat itself quite a lot, but we only kind of these days have to get things badly wrong once, whereas
Right.
in the past they kind of usually would get another chance, even if they caused the most amount of destruction that they were capable of doing.
Mhm.
um so yeah, I, I think you'd like to think that we kind of are cognizant of those risks, but you know, are we? Are we?
Right.
Yeah. Well, there's something we like to end every episode on, and I think because of this wide-ranging um, topics that you've covered, I mean, I wanted to spend a little bit more time on it, but um, we like to say that there's everyone lives within driving distance of something cool historically. As far as where you filmed, places that I find interesting, or specifics to the historical events that you guys have covered on your channel, what are some places that people can go visit if they're listening right now that might are worth taking a look at if you're a fan of history or interested in any of these things?
Yeah, great question. So I live about 20 minutes away from a city called Bath in the United Kingdom. And Bath is very famous, as the name suggests, for being somewhere that the Romans discovered hot springs. And you can still go and see the Roman baths, and
Mm.
and all the kind of curse tablets that people were throwing into the water, and the different gods that they were worshipping there. So I love that. From an ancient historian perspective. But Bath is also like a beautiful city, and is kind of a Georgian playground. So most of the architecture is from the 18th century, and it's somewhere that the wealthy people from London would come and sort of spend the summer in Bath, and it still feels like that today. So there's something called the Royal Crescent, which is unique architecturally. There are lovely bridges, and yeah, in many ways, it is a snapshot in time to a period where um, other people were having fun, which is quite nice.
For the
Right.
Americans who are unfamiliar, the Georgian era is roughly like our colonial era to early republic. Lynn,
Yeah, yeah,
yes,
very
Mhm.
much so.
somewhere around
So
there. Okay.
I'm sure they would have been discussing the American Revolution in coffee houses in
Yes.
Bath at the time, definitely.
Now, this may be something that's more US, to be fair, but what about battlefields? Do you find that maybe if it's not a battlefield like we would think of today, but just a location of a battle, do you find that that's something that is honored in a similar way in the US as it is in England? I mean, we'll have it, you're not allowed to take a pine cone off of it, and you have to be careful where you step because, blood was spilled here. It's sort of a almost sacred
Yeah,
space
and I
here in the
maybe
US battlefields.
I may be overthinking this, but I imagine there are so many in England. Like, where isn't
Right.
the site of some sort of historical
It's not like here.
Yeah,
engagement?
I would say there are so many. In most cases, all you will get is a small information board.
Hmm.
But I can think of 4 or 5 major battles that would happen within about 15 minutes of here. So
Wow.
King Alfred defeated the Great Viking Army at a place called Eddington. Now, to be fair, they don't know exactly where that is, but that is very, very close to here because the final Viking encampment was at a place called Chippenham. Very, very close to here. There's a battle at a place called Lansdowne, which is just north of Bath. That was during the English Civil War. Yeah, there are lots. I wouldn't say people pay them too much attention here, unless it's one of the really big ones like Hastings, for example. But yeah, I mean, I find them interesting. I suppose the difficulty is that the topography here just tends to have changed so much. It's quite hard to appreciate a battlefield if there's a giant supermarket in the middle of
Yeah.
it, which is quite
Didn't-
often the case.
Didn't you guys lose the body of a king under a parking lot or something like that?
That's right.
Yeah. So Richard III was discovered.
That's right.
Under a Leicester car park. Big discovery over here. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Bosworth Battlefield, that's actually one that is fairly well preserved, I think, and has an information centre, but quite rare for that to happen here.
Right.
I don't mean to be critical of the way you guys do things over there, but you should probably keep track of those,
Yeah, those kings.
bodies of kings.
It's
They're everywhere.
There's just too many. Yeah. I've got one in the cupboard back here. Yeah.
Well, Louie, thank you so much for joining us, and for those listening, his YouTube channel is Survive History. And how often do you post? When can people expect videos?
So our documentaries come out roughly every 2 months because they're quite involved, big productions. But our next one on World War I cavalry is available at the end of April, and then after that, we've got 2 very, very big episodes on the American Revolution coming out in a collaboration with History Hit. So that is quite exciting for us.
Do we get you on a horse for the cavalry episode?
Yeah. Yes, and in the American
All
Revolution
right.
episode, even though I don't necessarily need to be, but I just like it now.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, be sure to subscribe. We'll have a link in the show notes below. And as always, this conversation was brought to you by our supporters over on Patreon, where you can get early access if you sign up to the video versions of these episodes, as well as additional behind-the-scenes stuff and some tidbits, and direct access to Lynn and myself via our Discord, so you can join in and to any history discussions that we may be having there. So please go check that out at patreon.com/primary source media. And again, it's Louie's channel is youtube.com/ is it at Survive History, or is it just slash Survive
I think
History?
it's /@ Survive History, I think.
Yeah, so youtube.com / Survive History if you happen to be listening to this in the car, but we'll also have a link in the show notes below.
Yes.
Thanks so much for being with us, Louie.
Thank you
Thank
very
you
much
so
for having me.
much.
Cheers.